Welcome to this lesson in the hand sculpting course. In this lesson, we're going to be going over the bones of the hand, and we're going to be sculpting the hand as our assignment. So understanding the bones of the hand is really essential for sculpting the hand in clay, really representing the hand in any medium. It's important to understand the bones because the bones make up about 90% of the mass of the hand. So if you can understand the bones, then you're well on your way to understanding the hand as a whole, which is why this might be one of the most important studies for the course. So first, let's go over the proportions of the hand. The hand itself is about the size of the face. This I did slightly larger than my hands. We can separate the hand itself into three groups. There's the wrist, the palm, and the fingers, or in bone terms, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. Achieving accurate proportions is essential, and that's made a little bit easier if you remember the halves method. So you take the distance from the beginning of the wrist to the tip of the middle finger, you cut that in half, and that's about where the metacarpals end, or this first large knuckle of the hand. So half of that. Half, half. Then you cut that in half again, and that's where the next knuckle is. Cut that in half again, and you get where that final knuckle is, and then half of the tip of the finger is where the fingernail begins. Hopefully we've gone over that enough times where you remember that as a quick and dirty tip to get about the right proportions of the hand, and then you just follow the gestures of the hand to get the lengths of the other fingers. The knuckles aren't aligned horizontally, they follow these curved rhythms through the hand. Makes the hand much more interesting, and we want to include those rhythms in this anatomy study. Remember that the webbing between the fingers happens about halfway up this first phalange, and that webbing is tilted at an angle, so it's tilted forward. So on the palm side, that knuckle is about in the middle of this padded area of the palm. Remember that when you're considering the halves method, because the halves method is based on the bones and not that fleshy landmark of the webbing of the fingers. Now let's focus on the wrist, or the carpals. So there's 8 bones in the wrist. They all have complex shapes and forms, but even when the wrist is posed at extreme angles, it's really hard to make out any of those bony forms on the surface. You might see a little bump or something here and there, but for the most part, these can be simplified into a basic form. So while I'm sculpting these, I'm really just thinking about simplifying it and looking for the shapes in between these bony features and getting a rough idea of the shape that these carpals make in the wrist. So the shape from the side view, from the front view, and from the back view, and kind of thinking them as one group. And the bottom of this makes kind of a semicircle shape, and that fits into the groove of the wrist that these bones of the wrist make, the ulna and the radius. And all of these bones kind of fit in there and then allow the rotation forward and back and a little bit side to side. So the wrist has a lot more flexibility this way, moving back and forth, than it does when moving from side to side, though it does still have some movement side to side. So those are the carpals. Then beyond that, we have the metacarpals, which is just translated to beyond the wrist. And these make up a roughly square shape for the palm of the hand. As you're sculpting these bones, notice the curvature of them. The wrist has an inside curve, and that curve also exists in the bones. So it's curved this way, it's also curved this way, so it's kind of like this bowl shape on the inside, or concave shape and convex on the back of the hand. And something I noticed as I was sculpting the bones is that the bones really do inform the shape of the entire hand, and we'll see that more as we move on to the phalanges. The thumb has a special joint, a saddle joint, that makes it extra flexible and able to rotate in many different directions, giving us our posable thumbs. And as you're sculpting these, you'll notice that the metacarpals and the phalanges have a similar structure to them. They're curved in a similar way, and the bottoms are more flat with the tops more rounded so that the joint above can fit and rotate on top of the one beneath. All right, now let's move on to the phalanges. The hinge joints allow for flexion. This allows for the fist grabbing motion, holding things. And notice that the first joint of the fingers has some flexibility from side to side. You can kind of wiggle it around. But the next joints, there's really no wiggle room from side to side. It's just forward and back, up and down. If you look at the back of your knuckle and kind of flex your finger forward, there's 2 bumps that continue all the way around. These are called condyles. And if you think of these condyles as wheels, they don't go directly forward and back. They're kind of tilted out so that the back of the knuckle is a little bit more narrow. And as it moves to the front of the knuckle, it becomes wider. And that's true of all of the knuckles of the phalanges. So this knuckle up here, there's 2 bumps on the back that are closer together, and then as it moves forward, they spread out and they're farther apart. And you can see them really distinctly, or I've tried to lay them in distinctly on that front part of the knuckle. And then as you're sculpting them, remember that there's that slight curvature that bends in towards the middle finger. Can maybe exaggerate that a little bit more. So there's kind of this nice curvature this way. Another thing to realize is that there's rarely a boxy shaped bone if you were to cut the bones in half. So if I was to cut this one in half, it would be shaped more like a triangle. And often there's one like flat side of the triangle and then it's more rounded towards the other side. So on the metacarpals, it's kind of flat on the back side and then rounded on the front. But then with the phalanges, it actually reverses. So the front side is more flat and then it's rounded on the back. Little things that you notice as you're studying the hand. So for this assignment, I want you guys to do a life-size hand study sculpture of the bones of the hand. You can use the provided 3D models, or there's also the Skelly app that has the bones of the hand. Now, I wouldn't worry about getting the texture perfectly accurate, but do pay attention to the shape of the phalanges, the metacarpals, and the tarsals. Pay attention to the bones of the forearm and how they connect to those carpals, how the carpals connect to the metacarpals, and how the metacarpals connect to the phalanges. If there's any area or any bone that's giving you a hard time, just focus on its silhouette or outline. So turn it to the side, get the silhouette from that angle with a wall of clay, and then turn it 90 degrees and focus on the silhouette from that angle and get a rough outline, and then try to connect those 2 silhouettes by thinking about if they're connected in a way that's rounded or more blocky. Look for those flat areas and rounded areas. Okay, in the premium course, I'm going to go over a more guided demo of my sculpture of this, and we'll talk about the things that I was thinking about as I'm sculpting this hand anatomy bone study. We'll also be adding some muscles onto these bones, so that hopefully by the time that we're done, we have a really good understanding of the anatomy. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you around.